On the morning of the 12th of January 1949, the air over Circle, Montana froze so rapidly and deeply that a man's wet breath would fall to the ground as solid ice before it could even leave his lips. But 2 months earlier, in November of 1948, nobody on the windswept eastern Montana prairie was thinking about historic catastrophes, even though the late autumn wind was already cutting across the open range with a sharpness that warned of a long, unforgiving winter. It was a time of immense transition across the American West, a post-war era where the old ways of doing things were being pushed aside by a massive rush toward modern machinery, industrial steel, and chemical advancements. On a modest homestead 5 miles north of town, 63-year-old Knut Lind stood in his yard, watching the gray clouds gather on the northern horizon. Knut was a man of Norwegian heritage, with a face lined by decades of hard prairie sun and calloused hands that had handled thousands of cattle over his lifetime. He was a quiet, deliberate thinker who moved slowly but purposefully, guided by a deeply ingrained respect for ancestral building practices and a belief that nature always demanded humility from those who worked the soil. Beside him stood his 25-year-old son, Arvid, who had recently returned from flying cargo planes in the Berlin airlift. Arvid was a product of the post-war generation, filled with an unshakable faith in modern logistics, heavy diesel engines, and the triumph of American engineering. He believed that the war had proven that human ingenuity and industrial power could conquer any natural obstacle, and he looked at his father's traditional ranching methods with a mixture of impatience and quiet embarrassment. Arvid wanted to spend their limited winter savings on modern, oil-burning space heaters and reinforce their standard wooden barn with heavy plywood panels, arguing that they needed to embrace the future if their ranch was going to survive in the modern era. But Knut had different plans that seemed completely backward to his son. Knut carried a childhood memory of his grandfather surviving a legendary Norwegian freeze outside Trondheim in the late 19th century, using nothing but simple agricultural materials to protect his livestock when every other rancher in the valley lost their herds. Guided by that memory, Knut walked out into a stubbled wheat field 300 yards from the ranch house, carrying only a wooden stake, a length of heavy hemp rope, and a bucket of white lime. As Arvid watched in silence, his father drove the stake deep into the cold earth and began walking in a wide, methodical circle, pacing out a diameter of exactly 45 feet and leaving a white chalk line behind him. Arvid shook his head, asking why they were wasting daylight pacing out circles in the dirt when they had a perfectly good traditional barn that needed repairs. Knut did not answer right away. He only straightened his back, looked at the horizon, and said that the wooden barn was a drafty trap that would bleed heat the moment the real cold arrived, and that they were going to build something that could breathe with the prairie instead of fighting it. Within 2 hours, the first flatbed trucks arrived from the local cooperative, loaded to the limits, with tightly compressed 70-pound bales of alfalfa brome hay. The drivers unloaded the bales in massive, golden stacks at the edge of the circle, laughing and joking with each other about whether the old Norwegian was planning to build a giant playground or if he had simply lost his senses before the first snow could even fall. Arvid felt the sting of their laughter, but he helped his father unload the trucks anyway, his frustration growing with every bale they stacked on the frozen grass. To Arvid, this was a complete waste of valuable winter feed and a regression into primitive, unproven history at a time when their neighbors were investing in modern, steel-framed pole barns. But Knut only smiled at the driver's jokes, running his hand over the dry, sweet-smelling brome and telling his son that they were about to build a structure that would still be standing when the modern steel barns were nothing but collapsed, frozen ruins. The work of building the hay igloo was a monument to manual labor, a slow and exhausting process that stretched over 7 long days under an increasingly dark and heavy Montana sky. Each 70-pound bale had to be lifted, aligned, and positioned with ordered precision, demanding every ounce of strength from the old rancher and his son. The air was thick, with the golden dust of alfalfa and brome, which rose in clouds under their boots and stuck to their sweating skin, mixing with the cold prairie wind to create a constant, prickly discomfort. But as the first circular course of bales was laid down, Arvid began to realize that his father was not just piling hay in a random heap. Knut was executing a highly organized, dual-wall design that revealed a sophisticated understanding of natural insulation. He was laying down 2 concentric rings of hay, leaving a critical 12-inch air gap between the inner and outer walls. This gap was designed to function as a convective barrier. Knut explained to his Plözen son that still air was the ultimate insulator, and that by trapping air within this dead zone, they were creating a barrier that would prevent the freezing winds from stripping warmth away from the interior of the structure. Each bale was placed with the string side facing inward, ensuring that the tightly compressed grass remained structurally stable and wouldn't loosen under the pressure of the build. As the walls rose past 4 feet, then 6, the physical strain grew more intense. Knut's hands, though stiffened by age, moved with a practiced efficiency that Arvid had to struggle to match. The prickle of the straw was relentless, and the cold wind froze the sweat on their brows the moment they stopped to rest. But Knut refused to rush, tamping down each bale with a heavy wooden mallet to ensure there were no gaps or weak points in the 27-growing structure. At a height of 8 feet, the most complex phase of the prosted build began. The gradual inward can that would form the self-supporting dome. Knut explained that they did not need expensive timber trusses or steel supports to hold up the roof. Instead, they would rely on the natural physics of the KT and corbelled arch. Each subsequent tier of bales was offset inward by exactly 6 inches, creating a spiraling pattern that distributed the structural load through pure compression. Every bale pressed against its neighbors, locking the rings together so tightly that the structure became stronger with every layer they added. Arvid watched in fascination as the golden dome began to curve overhead, defying his post-war engineering assumptions and creating a massive, organic shape that rose 14 feet at its center point. The final cap bales were driven into the apex with the mallet, sealing the dome's crown and creating an airtight, self-supporting vault that felt remarkably solid. The final structural detail was the entrance, which Knut positioned on the southeast side of the dome at precisely 135 degrees from true north. He built the doorway narrow and low, barely 4 feet wide and 7 feet high, just large enough for a single cow pass through comfortably. But the genius lay in the angle of the entryway walls, which Knut slanted inward at 15 degrees to create a natural baffle. Knut explained that the prevailing winter gales in eastern Montana always blew out of the northwest at roughly 305 degrees. By positioning the entrance southeast, slanting the walls, they created a 170-degree offset. The freezing wind would have to curve almost completely around the circular dome to reach the entrance, losing its velocity in the process. Any air that did attempt to enter the 20A doorway would compress against the angled walls, creating a pocket of back pressure that would effectively seal the opening against the worst of the winter drafts. When the build was finally complete, the hay dome stood massive and silent on the prairie, a smooth golden igloo that looked completely out of place against the windswept range. It was a structure built entirely from the materials of the land, requiring no fuel, no steel, and no modern machinery to exist. Arvid stood back, wiping the dust from his eyes, and looked at the Tanakandis, creation with a strange mixture of exhaustion and growing respect, wondering if this ancient Norwegian breathing house would actually stand a chance when the real Montana winter finally arrived. By the end of November, news of the Lind family's golden hay dome had spread across the county, and it didn't take long for the local ranching community to deliver its verdict. The primary voice of this skepticism was George Vance, the wealthiest and most prominent rancher in the Circle area. Vance owned thousands of acres and had recently invested over $15,000 in a state-of-the-art steel truss pole barn. His structure was the pride of local modernism, featuring galvanized steel roofing, insulated windbreak panels, and automated ventilation fans powered by a heavy diesel generator. To Vance, progress was measured in steel, concrete, and the constant consumption of fuel, and he viewed Knut's hay dome as an embarrassing regression into primitive history that threatened the progressive reputation of the entire valley. One afternoon, Vance rode over to the Lind property on his sleek gelding, sitting high in the saddle, with his arms crossed as he surveyed the completed dome. He did not bother to hide his amusement, calling the structure an Indian hut and a giant pile of dry tinder. He told Knut that the first high wind would blow the whole thing into the next county, and that if a stray spark from the ranch house chimney ever hit that brome, the entire herd would be roasted alive inside a golden oven before anyone could even run for a bucket of water. The skepticism grew even more official when Arthur Pendleton, the young, university-educated county agricultural extension agent, arrived to conduct a formal inspection. Arthur was a representative of the new wave of scientific farming, a man who carried USDA handbooks in his leather satchel and believed that all agricultural problems could be solved through structured, modern engineering. Arthur walked around the dome with a clipboard, taking measurements and shaking his head with a look of professional concern. He told Knut that the structure violated every established safety code in the modern manuals. He warned that the lack of active mechanical ventilation would lead to a rapid, toxic buildup of ammonia from the cattle's waste, which would rot the animals' lungs within weeks. He argued that the moisture generated by 50-plus cows would quickly saturate the hay bales, dropping their insulation value to zero and creating damp, moldy conditions that would trigger spontaneous combustion. He pointed out that they were trusting 16 tons of unreinforced hay to support its own weight, and that the first heavy snow load would trigger a catastrophic collapse, burying their entire breeding stock alive. The local Cattlemen's Association held its December meeting shortly after Arthur's visit, and the discussion quickly turned to the Lind homestead. The Lind ranchers, influenced by Vance's warnings and Arthur's official report, voted unanimously to send Knut a formal letter expressing their deep concern for animal welfare and urging him to relocate his herd to a conventional, modern shelter before the real winter hit. The letter was delivered to the Lind kitchen table, and Arvid felt the heavy weight of social isolation settling over his family. He walked the floor of the cabin, begging his father to listen to the, quote, experts, arguing that they couldn't afford to be the laughingstock of the county, and that if they lost their herd, they would lose the ranch to the bank by spring. But Knut only folded the letter slowly, placed it in his desk, and told his son that the experts knew a great deal about buildings, but they had forgotten how to listen to the land, and that they would let the winter deliver the final verdict. In the first week of December, Knut quietly moved his herd 54 head of pristine Black Angus cattle, led by his prized 2,000-pound bull named Goliath, into the Golden Dome. The animals entered the structure single file, through the narrow-angled doorway, their dark coats contrasting sharply against the bright golden alfalfa. Within hours, they had adjusted to the space, their hooves sinking into the thick, 12-inch layer of dry wheat straw that Knut had spread across the floor. Arvid, still anxious from the town's criticism, spent his evenings sitting at the kitchen table with his notebooks, calculating the thermal mathematics of the herd. He knew that a resting black Angus cow generated approximately 1,500 BTUs of heat per hour through its normal.com metabolic processes. With 54 head inside, the herd was producing over 81,000 BTUs of continuous, passive thermal energy every single hour. And the unique geometry of the dome was designed to capture every bit of it. The interior of the hay dome was a revelation in passive climate control. Unlike a conventional wooden barn, which suffered from cold drafts and convective heat loss through every wall seam, the hay dome was completely still and silent. The thick hay walls absorbed the sound of the wind, creating a muffled, almost sacred quiet inside, where the only sound was the steady rhythmic chewing of the ride cattle. But the most remarkable feature was the structure's passive moisture management. Arthur Pendleton had predicted that the humidity from 54 cows would turn the dome into a wet, moldy trap. But the hay itself was hygroscopic, meaning it naturally absorbed excess moisture from the air during the day when the cattle were active. At night, as the outside temperature plummeted and the cattle bedded down, the dry hay slowly released that moisture back into the air, preventing any condensation or ice from forming on the tin interior surfaces. The cattle's coats remained perfectly dry and clean places 2ATZ. Their breath rose in soft, warm clouds that drifted up to the peak of the dome and circulated gently back down. By mid-December, the first real freeze of the season arrived, dropping the tin outside temperature to a bitter 15 below zero. It was a clear, dry, cold that tested every building in the valley. George Vance's modern steel barn immediately began to show its design limitations. Because the steel frame conducted cold instantly, the interior walls began to sweat with condensation, which quickly froze into a thick layer of ice that dripped freezing water onto his herd. To keep his cattle from freezing, Vance had to run 2 propane heaters continuously, burning through fuel at a rate of $12 per day and driving up his operational costs. But inside Canute's hay dome, without a single space heater or propane burner, the temperature held at a steady, comfortable 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The 12-inch air gap between the hay walls acted as a perfect thermal break, preventing the outside cold from penetrating the interior. The hay walls themselves had warmed to 28 degrees on the Place inside surface, creating a radiant heat effect that kept the cattle calm and relaxed. Arvid checked the herd twice daily, measuring the interior temperature with his thermometer and recording the numbers in his notebook with a growing the Fincher Wine's sense of wonder. The hay dome was maintaining a temperature 36 degrees warmer than the outside air, purely through passive design and the cow's own body heat. The breathing house was working exactly as Canute's grandfather had described, and Arvid began to realize that the ancient Norwegian wisdom he had mocked was far more advanced than any USDA manual. The winter of 1948-1949 did not arrive in increments. It descended on eastern Montana with a sudden devastating violence that shattered 75 years of weather records. On the afternoon of January 8th, the barometric pressure began, a precipitous, terrifying drop that signaled the arrival of a massive Alberta bomb cyclone. The sky, which had been a clear, cold blue, turned a strange, bruised shade of greenish-gray as the wind went dead calm, leaving the prairie in an eerie, suffocating silence that made the horses shift restlessly in their corrals and the birds vanish from the trees. Then the wind arrived, a low, rumbling growl from the northwest that quickly rose to a deafening, continuous howl, bringing with it an Arctic air mass that drove the temperature down to an 80 unbelievable 30 below zero in a matter of hours. By midnight, the blizzard was raging in full fury, and the world outside the Lind Ranch house disappeared into a horizontal wall of blinding, screaming white. The storm lasted for 6 relentless days, a continuous onslaught of wind and snow that tested every structure and every living thing in the valley. The wind, sustained at 40 miles per hour, with gusts that shrieked across the open prairie at over 55, turning the heavy snowfall into a barrage of frozen needles that scoured the paint off buildings and made breathing outdoors almost impossible. The logistical systems that the county had relied on for decades collapsed almost immediately. Power lines, weighed down by inches of ice, snapped under the wind's fury, plunging the modern ranches into darkness. The snow piled up in massive, dense drifts that blocked roads and driveways, packing so tightly under the wind's pressure that even heavy highway plows couldn't clear them, leaving the homesteads completely isolated from the outside world. In his state-of-the-art steel barn, George Vance faced a catastrophe of modern engineering. His automated ventilation fans, which required electricity to run, stopped turning the moment the power lines snapped. Within hours, the moisture and carbon dioxide from his 73 head of cattle began to build up to toxic levels, turning the interior air into a hot, suffocating fog that smelled of ammonia. Desperate to save his herd from suffocation, Vance was forced to crack open his heavy sliding doors just 4 inches to allow fresh air to enter. But that 4-inch gap became a funnel for the Arctic gale, which rushed inside and dropped the barn's temperature to 5 below zero in minutes. His backup, propane heaters, which consumed fuel at an alarming rate, quickly drained his storage tanks. By the 3rd day of the storm, Vance's fuel supplier called to say that the drifted roads were impassable and that no delivery trucks could reach him. His propane ran out, and his cattle, already stressed by poor air, quality, and damp coats, began to huddle together in the freezing darkness, their shivering bodies burning vital calories just to stay alive. Across the valley, the same story of modern vulnerability repeated itself on every ranch that had abandoned traditional methods for active, energy-dependent systems. But on the Lind homestead, the hay dome sat silent and protected in the wide middle of the windswept range. The snow accumulated rapidly on the windward side of the dome, building a massive white slope that eventually reached the structure's apex and buried the northwest wall under a dense, protective blanket. But the aerodynamic, curved shape of the dome prevented the wind from grabbing the structure or piling up a destructive, crushing load on a flat roof. The snow simply slid off the curved sides, creating a natural, insulating mound that sealed the hay walls from the wind entirely. Inside, the 54 black Angus cattle remained calm and comfortable, protected from the horizontal fury of the storm by a golden fortress of grass that required no fuel, no electricity, and no modern machinery to keep them warm. By the morning of January 12th, the thermometer outside the Lind Ranch house had stopped registering. The mercury column had retracted completely into its bulb, indicating a temperature of 52 degrees below zero, and the wind was still screaming out of the northwest with a relentless, terrifying force. For 6 days, Canute and Arvid had been trapped inside the house, listening to the wind rattle the timber walls and watching the frost build up in thick, intricate patterns on the kitchen windows. But their minds were on the cattle, invisible, now beyond the white wall of the storm, and Canute knew that they could not wait any longer to check on the herd. The hay dome sat 300 yards from the herd blank house, a short walk in summer, but in these conditions, with visibility measured in inches and a wind chill that reached 80 below, those 300 yards were a potentially fatal distance. They prepared for the journey with the methodical seriousness of men facing a survival mission. They pulled on multiple layers of wool, insulated coveralls, and heavy sheepskin coats, wrapping their faces in wool scarves until only their eyes were exposed, Finally, Canute tied a 70-foot length of heavy hemp rope around his waist, securing the other end to Arvid, who would follow him into the whiteout. They anchored the rope to the heavy timber post of the ranch house porch, ensuring they had a physical lifeline to guide them back if they became disoriented in the storm. Canute opened the door, and the Arctic gale rushed inside like a physical blow, instantly freezing the moisture on their skin and turning their breath into solid ice that coated their scarves. The walk across the yard was a terrifying battle against the elements. The wind was so strong that it repeatedly knocked them off their feet, forcing them to crawl through the waist-deep drifts on their hands and knees. The visual space was a chaotic, spinning void of white, where the ground, the sky, and the buildings merged into a single, disorienting wall of freezing snow. Arvid felt a cold, metallic fear rising in his chest, realizing that if the rope broke or if they lost their footing, they would wander the yard until the cold took them, unable to find their way back to a house only yards away. He looked at his father's figure ahead of him, moving slowly but steadily through the drifts, and realized that Canute's quiet determination was the only thing keeping them moving forward. After what felt like hours of crawling and stumbling, they reached the site where the hay dome stood. But the dome had completely disappeared, buried under a massive 14-foot snowdrift that reached from the ground to the structure's apex. The southeast entrance was drifted shut under 4 feet of hard-packed snow, sealed off from the world like a tomb. Canute did not hesitate. He pulled a short shovel from his belt and began digging into the drift, his movements slow but rhythmic, while Arvid joined him, throwing the heavy snow behind them as they fought to clear a passage to the doorway. The cold was relentless, biting through their heavy gloves and turning their fingers numb within minutes, forcing them to work in rapid, 15-minute shifts to prevent frostbite. Finally, Canute's shovel broke through the pack, and a soft, warm draft of air escaped from the opening, rising into the Arctic wind like a cloud of steam. Arvid cleared the last of the snow away, creating a narrow, low tunnel that led into the darkness of the dome. Canute slid inside first on his belly, with Arvid following close behind, dragging the hemp rope after him. As Arvid squeezed through the opening and stood up, he felt the heavy timber door of the Copperfist whirled close behind him, and the screaming fury of the Montana blizzard vanished into an absolute, sacred silence. Stepping through the narrow, snow-walled tunnel into the hay dome was a profound, sensory shock that Arvid would remember for the rest of his life. He went from a chaotic, howling world of 52 below zero and 80 below wind chill into a space of absolute dead silence that felt almost tropical. The air inside was warm, not hot, but a steady, comfortable 31 degrees Fahrenheit and completely still, smelling of sweet alfalfa, dry wheat straw, and the clean, metabolic warmth of the cattle. The transition was so sudden that Arvid pulled off his heavy gloves and wool scarf instinctively, feeling the soft, warm air on the cliff, his exposed skin for the first time in 6 days, his face tingling as the Franz circulation returned to his numb cheeks. In the dim light that filtered through the thick snow-covered hay walls, Arvid saw the 54 head of Black Angus cattle standing calmly in a loose circle around the perimeter. They were not shivering. Their dark coats were dry, clean, and their eyes were bright and curious as they looked at the 2 men who had crawled into their sanctuary. Even Goliath, the massive 2,000-pound bull, stood relaxed, chewing his cud with a steady, rhythmic content that showed no sign of stress or discomfort. Canute walked the perimeter of the dome slowly, checking each animal with his practiced, methodical efficiency. He examined their eyes, their pink mucous membranes, and their hooves, searching for any sign of frostbite or respiratory distress, and found absolutely nothing. The entire herd had survived the worst 6 days of the century without a single loss, a single injury, or a single symptom of cold-related illness. Arvid checked his thermometer and recorded the numbers in his notebook, his fingers trembling not from cold, but from a deep, overwhelming emotion. On January 12th, at 12 p.m., with the outside temperature sitting at 52 below zero, the inside of the dome measured 31 above, representing an incredible temperature differential of 83 degrees. The physics of the Igloo had performed beyond his most optimistic calculations. The massive snowdrift on the windward side, which he had feared would crush the dome, had instead transformed the structure into a perfect thermal envelope, adding an extra layer of insulation that completely sealed the hay walls from the freezing wind. The 54 cattle, huddled together in their circle, had functioned as a perfect thermal engine, their 81,000 BTUs of metabolic heat trapped within the dome's efficient geometry and held steady by the 16 tons of compressed hay. Arvid looked at his father, who was standing quietly beside Goliath, running his calloused hand over the bull's warm neck, and felt a profound sense of humility wash over him. He realized that the modern progress he had worshipped, the steel trusses, the propane heaters, the automated fans, had failed his neighbors because they were dependent on external fuel and electricity. But Knut's hay dome, built from the simple materials of the land and guided by the ancient memory of his grandfather, had succeeded because it was a living, breathing system that worked with the laws of nature instead of trying to conquer them. The old Norwegian had been right all along, and Arvid knew that the lesson he had learned in the golden silence of the dome had saved more than their hurt it, had saved his understanding of what it truly meant to be a rancher on the Persant Montana plains. On the morning of January 13th, the great blizzard finally broke, and the sun rose over a frozen, silent valley that looked like an Arctic desert. Arthur Pendleton, the young county extension agent, struggled out to the Lind homestead on his snowmobile, his heart heavy with dread. He had spent the last 3 days collecting reports of devastating livestock losses across the county, and he expected to find Knut and Arvid half frozen in their cabin and their herd dead inside a collapsed mound of hay. When Arthur arrived, he found Knut and Arvid working together to clear a permanent, stable tunnel to the dome's entrance. Arthur stepped off his machine, his face pale with cold and worry, and asked if they had lost everything. Knut did not answer. He only gestured toward the tunnel and invited the young agent to see for himself. Arthur crawled through the entrance, stood up inside the dome, and stopped in. His tracks, his eyes widening as the warm, silent air hit his face. He looked at the 54 head of Black Angus, standing healthy and calm, then pulled out his thermometer, watching the mercury rise steadily to 31 degrees. Arthur looked at the numbers, then at Knut, and the young man's professional pride completely collapsed. He broke down, tears of awe and humility rising in his eyes as he shook Knut's hand and apologized for his arrogance, admitting that his USDA manuals had been written by men who didn't understand the first thing about real Montana survival. The true accounting of the winter of 1949 was devastating for the rest of the 20 Valley. George Vance had lost 25 of his best cattle to pneumonia, freezing winds. His modern steel barn had turned into an icy tomb the moment his propane ran out, and his surviving stock were so depleted they would take months to recover. Across eastern Montana, the average herd mortality was nearly 20%, bankrupting several families and forcing others to sell their land. But Knut Lind had lost zero. His cattle entered the spring breeding season in prime, healthy condition, and the community that had laughed at his golden igloo was suddenly forced to confront a cold, hard reality. The transition was quiet but profound. Within weeks, the local cattlemen's association held another meeting. But this time, there was no talk of warning, letters, or modern codes. George Vance himself stood before the ranchers, swallowed his pride, and admitted that his $15,000 barn had been outperformed by a pile of grass, urging every man in the room to go study Canute's design. Arthur Pendleton commissioned a formal study of the hay dome, hiring a photographer to document the construction methods and preparing a bulletin that was distributed to ranchers across 5 states, ensuring that Canute's traditional engineering would never be forgotten again. Our story ends on a quiet evening in late March, as the snow finally began its reluctant retreat from the prairie, and the first green shoots of grass appeared through the melting drifts. Arvid and Canute stood together near the hay dome, watching the Black Angus herd graze in the soft spring sunlight. Arvid pulled out his notebook, looked at the hand-drawn sketches of the double-wall circles, and then looked at his father. He didn't say thank you, and he didn't apologize they were Lynn's, and they didn't waste words on things that were already understood. He only said that they had some good alfalfa left over from the dome, and that they should probably save the seeds for the next build. Canute nodded, his weathered face creasing into a quiet, satisfied smile, knowing that his son had finally learned the most important lesson the frontier could teach, that when the storms of life arrive, the only progress that matters is the kind that keeps you warm. In the decades that followed, the hay dome of Circle, Montana, became a legendary symbol of resilience across the northern plains. Canute Lynn's hand-drawn blueprints, once mocked as a primitive retreat, were copied by hundreds of ranchers who realized that true stewardship of the land required humility, not just machinery. Arvid Lind eventually took over the ranch, preserving the ancestral methods alongside modern tools, always ensuring his children understood that the wisest solutions are often the ones our ancestors already paid for with their survival. Today, modern sustainable architecture and agricultural sciences have fully validated Canute's intuitive design. The double-wall insulation, passive thermal, mass, and natural moisture regulation of the hay igloo are taught in universities as prime examples of passive climate control. It stands as a timeless reminder that when the storms of life arrive, survival isn't about having the most expensive equipment, it's about having the right design and the quiet courage to trust it. If this story changed how you think about traditional knowledge versus modern progress, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Let us know in the comments what traditional skill or piece of wisdom from your family's process past has been forgotten that we need to remember today. We read every single comment, and your stories keep this history alive.